Hello, 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 and welcome to Pop Culture Therapy. I'm Cruellica Kain.
And I'm Advent Nebula.
And this week we're going to talk about Kentaro Miura. He is the creator of Berserk. And so we wanted to kind of give a tribute to him because he recently died, sadly, on May 6th. So it's been
roughly a month and a half by the time this one will be going up.
Exactly. And he's been an influence since the late 80s, really, with Berserk itself. And I know he has been influenced by so much, being it Go Nagai's work with Violence Jack, Fist of the North Star, as well as the Hellraiser series, and just in general, he likes creativity. Yeah. He enjoys shoujo manga.
Yeah, what influenced him the most in his storytelling between Griffith and Guts was Rose of Versailles of all series. Imagine that.
And so he's a fascinating creator, and while he's done a lot of different works, most notably it's always going to be Berserk.
Which, amazingly, not just in Japan, but worldwide, and you're seeing this even today, has had influence on artists, whether they're dark fantasy or just fans of the genre itself, going into today. I mean, you really cannot pick up many dark fantasies that from people who grew up on Berserk that aren't influenced by it.
Well, one thing I've learned that I find so awesome is that Guts was the inspiration for Cloud in Final Fantasy VII.
Yeah.
Obviously, they look nothing alike, but just the idea of the presentation as well as having that gigantic sword.
Yeah, and you see it in Dark Souls and Bloodborne with the monster designs, the references. The creator of Dark Souls and Bloodborne himself admitted that he took a lot of inspiration from Berserk when he ended up coming up with the idea of Dark Souls, Demon Souls, and Bloodborne itself, and has pulled from that. And it's not just Berserk, but also H.P. Lovecraft, if you've played the games, also had a major influence.
And Devil May Cry also took a lot of inspiration from Berserk because of the aesthetics of monsters, as well as just the character presentations and how the character personalities work. So it kind of makes sense because when you think of Dante, he really is a perfect blend of both Guts and Griffith.
Yeah, and the conflict between Dante and Virgil is basically the same kind of conflict you have with Guts and Griffith.
Exactly.
Just being at a family level instead.
So if you're not familiar with the Berserk series, it is violence galore. I'm not going to sugarcoat that, but it's done in a very interesting and receptive manner.
Yeah. This first couple of chapters, you're introduced into the world post the demonic Armageddon. But when you get into the flashback, it opens with Guts' birth. His mother's hanging from a tree, and she gives birth to him while she's dying.
Yes. And Guts is obviously the titular character for Berserk. And he is to be the embodiment of not really righteousness, but of being courageous and helping those that cannot fight for themselves.
Yeah. He ended up raised in a mercenary band with a mentor that is probably one of the worst mentors you could ever have, and couldn't put up with the abuse anymore at the age of 12, killed his mentor and went wandering on his own and became a mercenary with the name noted for himself by the time he was 20, when he runs into who eventually becomes the antagonist of the series, Griffith.
And I think most people know Griffith because of how many memes there have been about him. But Griffith is one of those sympathetic characters because, without spoiling too much, his backstory is very tragic, similarly to Guts, but in a very drastic flip side, and where Guts is a believer of just giving of himself and fighting for those who are weak.
Griffith wants the ultimate power, believing only by being in power can he change the world.
But he still works to help the weak.
Yeah.
That's the one thing that has really bonded those two characters together, is that they're not doing it for the fact of they want to just become more powerful and take over the world. They're doing it because they want to give the weak or the less fortunate an even playing field.
Yeah.
And Griffith, where he does have fighting skill, but not to the level of guts, he utilizes manipulation and charisma.
And eventually ends up becoming a god, in a sense, with the demonic powers that exist. And that's where you see a lot of the influence in a lot of the extended works of authors and people who have grew up with Berserk or ended up becoming fans of Berserk.
Well, yes.
And amazes me just the influence worldwide Berserk has had.
Well, and thinking about it like this, there have been many popular mangas that the authors have said that we've taken influence from Berserk in one way or another. You have Blue Exorcist, Black Butler, Black Clover, Attack on Titan, just to name a few. And when you watch their series, you can actually feel and see the love for that property.
Yeah. And it really kind of surprises me with some of the Western comics, with some of the newer up-and-coming authors. As despicable as a villain he is, the man who created one of the more recent Batman villains, who I can't think of his name, but he's a serial killer with a pig face. He said, no, Berserk was an inspiration for me creating this twisted villain.
Well, and it makes sense because with the series, and we're not admittedly giving spoilers because we'd like everyone to experience it for themselves, is it actually grips you in how many different things you actually have to think about. Sometimes it makes you feel very uncomfortable, especially when things happen for a character named Casca. And it also makes you see kind of another example of your family is what you make of it, not what you're born into. Because the characters in this series, they are their own family. They built these bonds together. They were not built just because they were of blood relatives or blood relations.
Every single character in the story has a tragic blood family life that they had to come together and create their own family.
And every character, no matter how minor they are, both good and bad, has a purpose to the overall narrative. And that's something that you don't always see in a lot of writing. You'll have side characters that will exist because you want to help progress the story, but these side characters are so well developed, they progress the story naturally rather than being a forceful progression.
The only other series I can think of, and it started, ironically enough, the same time as Berserk was coming out, was Wheel of Time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of strange, the parallels, where we don't know with Miura if after whatever the notes he left, what's going to happen. But Wheel of Time got its own continuation and a finale thanks to the notes that were left.
Well, and that's the one tragedy when it comes to any element of popular fiction, be it manga or book form or even movie form. When you have a situation where the creator passes while in the midst of production of any of the content, you wonder, what happens next? Where do we go? And you have some individuals that say, well, if the person has died, why am I going to support the series because it's incomplete? But at the same time, if you don't support the series, even in its incompletion, you're basically just slapping the face of the creator and saying, well, it's a tragedy, but moving on.
Yeah, you want to support the work, and it is a well-told story. Yeah, it's left incomplete, and we don't know the future of what's going to happen. it all comes up to his two assistants, which both, even with the art and storytelling they are doing with their own series, they could continue on with it, but that's just going to come to a choice because he had no living relatives when he passed away and he was not married, so we don't know what is going to happen with his estate.
And that is the one challenge because in Japan, estate law is very different than it is here in the United States.
Trinity Blood, when the author passed away, he was in the same situation. The estate just ended up stopping everything that was going on, and the notes for what was going to be the final 2 volumes got compressed into the final episode of Trinity Blood.
And so the estate was able to, because they were able to have it purchased by someone else. Same thing happened with Peacemaker. Sadly, that did not happen with High School of the Dead because the author had died so recently to where, even though there was enough content for another season. And
his brother did not, who's still alive, his brother did not want another season made.
No. And then you have series like Itsura na Kiss, where, yes, this is a shoujo series. What they did is the family, because there was a husband and a living daughter, for the mangaka, her daughter and husband sold the rights to the series to an animation studio many, many years later. And the animation studio took a look at some of her notes and created an ending that was worthy of the series, so it didn't feel out of place.
And then you have a series like Bastard, which it just stops. And we don't know, and we know we're never going to get a completion on it.
I don't even know if the author's dead. It just stopped. But then again, Bastard is a whole animal in and of itself. But supposedly, rumor has it that there are still notes for at least 5 more chapters. That there are some notes there, and rumor is that the assistants have considered looking at trying to give it some sort of conclusion.
Yeah, what is known, he was almost done with the most recent chapter before he passed away. It's a tragedy in itself, too, because he apparently had been dead for 2 weeks before he had been discovered because he's such a recluse and really only communicated with his assistants whenever they didn't come over via email.
Especially because of COVID.
Yeah, with COVID, nobody had seen him for apparently a couple of months in person.
And it is a tragedy. Well, it's a tragedy when anyone passes away, but it is also a tragedy when you have someone who has been of great influence. Because while they'll still continue to be of influence because new people are going to discover the property daily, that's not going to stop just because he passed away. But it's a tragedy because we know where the end result was, not the full end result, but we know where most of the end result was at the beginning of the series, but we don't know how it was resolved. And that's always been my one wish for this particular series, especially now with the author having passed away, is just knowing what happens. And this is a good example at the same time of other popular series and what do we do for those that are still ongoing.
Yeah, in an interview in 2020, Miura ended up saying his greatest fear was dying before completing Berserk. He knew how he was going to end it, but it was like with Ono with One Piece. It was a matter of telling the story to get to that point.
Because just like Oda, Miura let the characters tell the story. He was just there for the ride like the rest of us. And I know that's such a strange concept when people hear that fictional characters continue to tell the story. But that also demonstrates the great markings of a storyteller when they're able to create such a dynamic universe that you can set one situation up and have it move 10 steps ahead. And this is an example of what authors need to prepare for, because this is not the only long-running series in Japan. And Kentaro Miura was relatively young. He was in his 50s, which most people could say, well, he lived over a half a century. Well, that may be true. In terms of modern lifestyle, especially for Japan, which is known for longevity, he died very young.
Yeah, most men in Japan live well into their 80s.
And so it's very sad to see that happen. And what I want to do as a tribute is just go over some of my favorite elements of the story, which first and foremost are really Guts. I thought Guts was an incredible character, and my first introduction admittedly was the anime, the original anime.
The one that covers what's known as the Golden Age arc.
Yes, and Guts just impressed me with his diligence and his love of life. Even though he kills a whole ton of people in the show because he's a fighter, his love of life and love of people was always fascinating.
And in his backstory of growing up as basically a mercenary child adopted by one of the worst people ever, and to still have that trust in people,
yes,
is one thing you don't see in storytelling a lot.
No, especially in, I would say, high fantasy.
Yeah.
Very often in high fantasy.
High dark fantasy, almost
yes,
never do you see a storytelling like this.
No, you see, for a character like him, he would not be the hero normally in dark fantasy.
And normally a character like Griffith, and that's a nice dynamic. In most high dark fantasy, a character like Griffith is usually the hero where Guts is the antagonist. And you can kind of say that truly does become what happens with when you get into the modern day storytelling of the story as opposed to the flashback that is the Golden Age arc.
But it's just impressive because you don't really see where things are going. Yes, you see in the first chapter, because I've read the manga since watching the anime, you see in the first chapter, just like in the first episode, the world has gone to hell. And Guts is trying to still wrap his head around everything that has happened.
One of the most tragic story beats in the manga, which even the newer anime never really touched on, is when Guts has to fight his child, which has become a demonic entity.
Mm-hmm.
And it amazes you just that Guts is even still able to keep his humanity after everything that's happened to him and even having to deal with this.
And it does also introduce one of the most tragic things that I have ever thought of in anime history, with what does happen for Casca, and having that told in story form. It was done in a way to show its tragedy. Because a lot of times with manga and anime, they will sugarcoat and pull back so that it's still hopeful.
Yeah, she ends up having her mind completely broken. And it takes... And neither of the anime series ever showed her full recovery. She does eventually get a recover from what happened, but it takes almost a full decade.
Oh, yes. And how about you? What are some of your favorite things about the series?
Griffith is one of those antagonists that you hate him, but you love him at the same time, especially for his quest for power, but you can see the influence Star Wars had on his storytelling as well. There's been a theory of one villain known as Zod the Immortal as being Guts' father, which you end up, as the storytelling goes along, it's the only logical conclusion that could happen for it to actually be the truth, and which we'll probably never get an answer to now. But another thing I just love about the series is just how unique the art style is. You never saw an art style like this until Berserk came around. Now you have some copycats, but the fine details to the art, just, you can't replicate it in animation.
Well, exactly. And especially because in Japan, manga is done in black and white. Sometimes they have colorized cover pages, but generally it's always black and white. And the amount of detailing you have to have for the diversity and colors to demonstrate action, to demonstrate appearance, and everything is fascinating. And even though I'm not an artistic person by any means, it's amazing how much you can take away from everything that was done.
And then the God Hand as a whole, the main villains of the franchise,
which are Kaiju no Kami's favorite.
Each one represents a version of humanity's corruption. And Void, as creepy as he is, has noble intentions when you think about what he's trying to do, even though he's going about it in a way we may not look at it in our world as just, but when you look at the world of Berserk, it's the only logical conclusion.
Exactly. And you can definitely see his love of Hellraiser with those gods.
Yeah, Salish and Void especially. Mm-hmm. And Salish, she wears her sexuality as not only as a way to corrupt, but as a way to empower herself as well.
Exactly. And that's something that is very notable in the Hellraiser series, when the, not Cenobites, for Cinnabon, but the Cenobites, they actually utilize something that's very similar to the God Hand of presenting different dark intentions of humanity.
Yeah, in the series, you see its influence, and what amazes me, heavy metal has had bands come out of the last few years that just breathe Berserk immensely with their albums. They usually have about 3 to 4 tracks just about an event that everybody that's read Berserk is like, oh yeah, I know that moment.
Well, exactly. And I know you referenced before, like, the difference between this and Game of Thrones, which it's really night and day.
Yeah.
I feel with Berserk, you have a cohesive story. And yes, it does have different factions like Game of Thrones does have. Everything has more of a symbiotic narrative where everything is a snowball effect or a butterfly effect to everything else. And I feel like in certain respects, when the Game of Thrones television series was being produced, I could see so many influences of Berserk.
Even though Martin has admitted he never read Berserk.
But you can just tell it. And obviously, there are elements of coincidence. It's high dark fantasy. Very often, it's kind of like sci-fi. There are certain cut and paste elements you typically have. But the similarities are there. But where Kentaro took it is he made it where even the villains, all the villains, had something that you questioned and wondered about.
And Clive Barker, as many of you may be surprised with some of his later works, said that his influence on Minoura has influenced some of his newer works, because he actually went and read Berserk when he heard how much of a fan that Hellraiser had an influence on Berserk.
And I'm just so proud to say that I lived in the world that Berserk existed. We could say that about so many series, but Berserk was one of those few series that made me, as a woman, think, wow, okay, I can get into these extremely dark fantasies, because generally they are made for more of a male audience. Dark fantasy, high dark fantasy, as this one is done, is generally more male-oriented, where you do have the dark fantasy that's female-oriented, but that's usually considered urban fantasy.
Yep.
So, and because it is so shonen and seinen in its presentation, it's not made for a female audience, but
the characters are so well written that a lot of female fans have come and learned to appreciate Berserk.
Exactly. And Kentaro Miura didn't neglect any of his audiences. Even if the focus was to be on a particular demographic, he didn't exclude the greater population.
Yeah. And there is a lot of rape in Berserk, but
Oh, yes.
the female fans of Berserk have commented on how well he's used the female characters that have had this tragedy happen to him and actually react in a realistic manner.
Yes, it's not like where in certain animes or manga where they pull back and the woman just springs back to normal and everything's kosher, everything's good. It's very tragic, it's very challenging, and I think in light of the Me Too movement as well, it is really representative of the emotional stance that women have to live through and how they have to cope with it.
And the way he's used demons in a storytelling fashion is just... You could tell it was wholly Western influence-wise, because you would never see this in a traditional Japanese storytelling as well.
Well, and one series that I feel, even though it's not technically said it takes a lot of influence, but I really feel it has, is Drifters. Drifters, even though it's a very different concept, I see so much of Berserk in its presentation and the way it treats the character dynamics, because it makes you look at characters in a very uncomfortable way.
Which is what Berserk has been very well known for.
Exactly, because of one of the primary characters, Griffith. You have to look at him. You go through so much of the anime and the manga, especially when you do the golden times, you are like, oh my god, he's such a good character, he's dealt with so much tragedy, and he still works so hard for the people. And when you progress and see what happens, you're like, am I a terrible person?
Yeah.
Because I still want a redemption for him. It makes you think.
As you go through later in the manga, when you're reading the Millennium Falcon arc, which the anime's third season ended right before the Millennium Falcon arc started.
Oh, for the newer anime.
This whole is like almost this entire arc outside of Guts and Casca on a ship to Puck's Island focuses on Griffith and his power struggle. And as much as you want to root against Griffith, at the same time, you start to see, okay, he has just motivations, even though he is still a horrible human being at this point in the storytelling.
And I will say for American authors, they can learn a lot from Berserk's presentation, because when you have a villain, for example, we're going to use Femto. Femto started off as Griffith. I think that's pretty much been spoiled for the world, even if you don't know the series. Griffith obviously was a very sympathetic character and turned into a villain that was so irreprehensible that you're like, why? And then you look at some American stories, and I'm going to point at Maleficent, perfect example. You utilize the live action stories to make her a sympathetic character, but when you watch the original movie, there is no sympathy.
Yeah.
She is a horrible, horrible person. And yes, you can do a tragic story to progress to get a character to that. You can't change the outcome of it.
And that's where Berserk's storytelling's so good. I mean, we know what Femto's like at this point, but then the focus of the story arc where you're like, okay, I can actually see where he's coming from, but you're still a horrible person.
Exactly.
But your goals are actually justified.
And it makes me sad because I want a conclusion. I want a conclusion for every series I watch. But I wish he had another day just for himself, if nothing else.
Yeah.
And it also demonstrates, I think, the challenge for being a manga author.
Yeah.
Because both male or female, you work very hard. And yes, you're working for something you love. I think manga authors and comic book artists are a great example of you have to truly love what
Yeah.
you do because you have extremely tight deadlines. And I think in Japan, the deadlines are much tighter than they are even in the States.
Unless you're an established author like Minoru was, or author Yu Hakusho and Hunter x Hunter, which they can set, and even Araki actually nowadays for JoJo's can set his deadlines himself. But if you aren't one of those, you have maybe 5 to 6 days to produce a...
And even with having more flexibility on setting your schedule, you still have those pressures of knowing how many people love your series, how many people are tuning into your series, and how many people have opinions.
Yeah.
And I can only imagine on that scale, and very few people, not even actors and actresses, ever get to that true scale. It's really writers and screenplayers that take on that massive responsibility. And I can only imagine how that has affected him, because him being so reclusive, he probably didn't have the best health. He probably ate terribly, probably lived terribly with smoking and different things like that, which are very common in Japan.
Yeah, Japan, smoking is considered a social norm, the same with after work drinking.
Yes, it's not like in the United States where we become so focused. Basically, smoking in Japan is like what it was back in the 50s and 60s in America.
Yeah. Hey, you have anything else to really add? Because the legacy of this man is going to live on for a long time.
Yes, his legacy is going to outlive us all.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is probably the most positive thing as an outcome.
And that's what every author wants.
And I think many authors justifiably deserve. If they can change the cultural zeitgeist of how people view a certain type of genre, they deserve to have that long-lasting legacy.
Yeah. Especially with a genre like dark high fantasy, which it's not a very common genre, but when there's one that comes out, it usually has major influences across the board. And
so I hope he can hear, and depending on your viewpoint, he may or may not, I hope he can hear how many people love him and thank him for everything he's done.
Yeah, Dark Horse says they have sold out of all of the copies and are doing reprint runs of their new hardcover 3-in-1 editions that are currently out, and it's going to be very interesting to see what this leads in the future of this and how much influence this is going to have.
Hopefully we don't have to have another tragedy like this in 2021.
Yeah.
That's my goal. But until next time, thank you for joining us, and bye!